members of the press, my colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. In this third lecture, I would like to term it as a lecture of hope, because my second lecture gave a very dim and gloomy picture of what we are. Yet, what we shall be and how we shall live depends on each and every one of us. It is not what the government is doing. It is not what UN is doing. It is what you and me are doing. And if we do these things correctly, then we have hope that despite the harsh situations that the climate change phenomena brings to Africa, we shall be able to cope. Now, let me begin by reviewing some of the issues that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start by looking at what is mitigation. Mitigation, if Daniel can put the first slide on, is simply the way we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Reducing the greenhouse gases into from the atmosphere, or eliminating them, which is impossible, depends mainly on what the government does. In developed countries, it is the government and the industry which does the research and find ways of doing, applying technologies that can reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. In Africa, we don't have the resources, we don't have the technology, and we have natural resources which are being exploited and with very little return or value addition. So with that, we have the problem that we can do very little mitigation as individuals, but our governments can do mitigation. And this is the difference. May I remind you that Africa, being what it is the largest continent in the world. You can put 5 other continents into Africa and still have room. But it is also the driest continent. It's next to Australia. So we have very little water resources. We have contributed very little to the present or past greenhouse gases. It is not our fault that the situation we have of climate change is here. It is others' fault. We have a very opportune time for us to accept the situation as it is and to work with others and collaborate with others to help reduce our chances of survival. And this is where the climate change conference has been leading us, and we have been trying to negotiate in order to see if we can have a better cooperation and collaboration with others who have made the globe this hot. Next slide, please. I've basically described what mitigation is, but some examples of mitigation is the use of electric vehicles for transportation, use of solar energy to generate electricity, geothermal energy to generate electricity, wind energy, and hydropower. Those sources of energy produce very little greenhouse gases. They don't produce any greenhouse gases. And therefore, if we can promote the use of those, we will be able to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. Then we have use of energy in housing. Houses normally provide about 40% of greenhouse gases. And therefore, if we have efficient energy sources in houses, then we are able to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases coming from housing. Luckily enough for Africa, we do not have extreme cold climates. So we rarely, except in the southern and northern Africa, which has some summer or winter, we rarely heat our houses. So most of our houses do not require heating, and therefore we don't produce as much greenhouse gases from the typical African houses, especially if you look at the African thatch houses, thatch-roofed houses. We have very little to talk about, okay? Efficient means of transport is where we contribute. Presently, most of the transport in Africa depend on individual cars or buses, which have very little capacity for people, carry very few people. Now, this is the area where we can improve a lot, that we can develop the policy and awareness of our people to know that the transport you use contribute to the amount of gases that you are going to emit in the atmosphere. And for that reason, the conversion from diesel fuel engines to electric engines should be introduced in the continent as quickly as possible if we can have enough electricity generation in the continent, which we still don't have. We can also enhance and encourage our people to use bicycles as a means of transport instead of jumping into the car wherever you want to go. And one thing which is much more frequent is that don't put your gasoline vehicle on the road. I had gone through describing what mitigation is. Mitigation is really the removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And that option is very limited for Africa because, first of all, we do not have the technology. And secondly, we don't have the financial and other resources. We have natural resources which are stored in the ground, and we exploit them, export them, but add very little value to our natural resources, which is the shame of Africa. If we are going to move forward in this area, we have to embrace some of the new technologies which have been developed elsewhere, and we have to beg, borrow, or learn how to import some of those technologies that are already being used. I had described that use of electric vehicles emit very little carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Solar energy also do the same. That's the same. Geothermal energy, wind energy, and hydropower are the safest eco-friendly sources of energy. I'm talking about energy that propels us and makes us do things. Then we have to have the awareness and create awareness that we increase energy use efficiency in buildings and workplaces. because buildings contribute about 40% of the greenhouse gases, particularly in colder climates. We are fortunate that in Africa, most of the time we are warm. And if you want to know or believe that Africa is that warm, and you will believe that if there was anybody who God loved most and best is an African, then you come to Africa because you can sleep at night without having the heavy blankets. Then we have the efficient means of transport. This is our area where we need a lot of mitigation, because the transport rely on fuel. And we have to change that system to electric vehicles. We have to encourage our people to use bicycles. And we have to encourage our people to share rides. Next, please. Next slide. We have a number of mitigation projects which are going in Africa. They are now, when I was writing this lecture notes, there were 5, but last week, Senegal announced that they are also going to produce 100 megawatt power in Senegal. So there are now 6. The Senegal one has not been started, but the countries that are doing mitigation in the continent with an energy production of 100 megawatts and above are South Africa, Morocco, and Egypt. We have with that the cast of power project agreements. The cast of power project agreements I will show later, but I want to remind you that you as the press, you are our leaders. You are not only there to transform and transmit news, you should also expose news. And when we come to big power, that is where big money is. And where there is big money, there is also big corruption. So I would urge the press to always be on the lookout for these power project agreements and expose where corruption is. Energy consumers, particularly the citizens of any country which is having these power productions, still pay a very high prices for electricity. I know of a family member who has a 2 or 3 bedroom house and has been billed for 28,000 shillings for the use of electricity in 1 month. He doesn't have a factory. He doesn't produce anything. But the electricity, Kenya Power and Lighting Company sends him a bill of 28,000. That just annoys the consumer and makes him want to cut off use of any electricity from the power generators. Next one, please. Next one. Let me give the examples here. I'll not dwell so much on this one, but the first one is the project which is called the New Solar Complex. It is one of the largest power production projects in the continent, and it is in Morocco, and it is supposed to, at its full blast, produce 782 megawatt per kilowatt hours of electricity, and it will offset 533,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions each year. That is mitigation, because it reduces the amount or avoids the use of greenhouse gases producing sources in Morocco by 533,000 tons of carbon dioxide. That is avoided carbon dioxide emissions. So that is a mitigation. The next one is there are solar power project in South Africa. And this power project, I want to use it as an example of the power project, the cause of the power project agreements. When it was planned, the power distributor in South Africa, ECOSOM, agreed to distribute the power on its grid. But in full blast, when it became working and it was ready, the ECOSOM told them that the grid was full. They could not load their extra power that they had produced. And hence, there were close to 80, 90 megawatt of electricity produced, which had nowhere to go and had to be dissipated on the power plant area. The question which I ask is, who paid for this? Because if it went into the grid, then the consumer would have paid it. But it did not go to the grid, and hence somebody must have paid for it. And these are the issues that the press could be looking at. When I'm talking on this, let me just give a few examples in Kenya. Another example in Kenya. We have right now a wind power, which has been Lodwar wind power, which has been connected to the grid. When it was started, there was an agreement between KenGen, KETRACO. KETRACO is the organization which builds the power lines, and the Kenya Power and Lighting, the distributor, that they will distribute the power coming from the windmill, 310 megawatts. When the windmills were full blast, it was completed, there was no line to transmit 310 to any grid. And so that 310 for a period was just dissipated in the power plant. The question which I'm asking is, who paid for this? Is this the reason why the power bills are very high in Kenya? Or how did they fulfill the contract between the windmill generator, power plant generator builders, and KETRACO and the Kenya Power and Lighting? Has Power and Lighting taken that bill and distributed to the people or not? I have no data to comment further on that, but this is some of the cause of power agreements that is messing the African continent. The next one, please. Next slide. Benban Solar Park is again in Egypt. It is the largest photovoltaic project, and it is planned and built to give 1.8 gigawatts of power from its 41 plant combined. So far, it's giving 786 megawatts of power, and the financing of this giant power plant producer is done by a consortium of banks. It is again, it will reduce to 2 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions when completed. Again, we have a power plant which is avoiding the emission of greenhouse gases. and making the globe safer and cleaner, and hence reducing the warming. We have also here, what I would like to explain is that there are two ways of using solar or producing power from solar. Those who are living like in South Africa, 10 degrees or 20 degrees below the equator or above the equator, do not have the advantage that those who are living on the equator have. The ones who are living on the equator can use solar cells, and I will show one which has been installed in Kenya shortly. But those who are living out there, you have to harness the sun. And you harness the sun by building a parabolic mirror, a concave mirror, which concentrates the light and hence makes the light fall in a certain place. And that can be done through a concave lens, concave mirror, parabolic mirror. And that's how we use that. And when you have that, you then have a salt. That light is directed to melt a salt. And the salt can be melted up to 500 or 600 degrees Celsius. Then that heat will now boil the water, and the water turns the turbine, which gives you the electricity. That is how to harness sunlight in the southern or northern. And most of these South African plants and North African plants are using parabolic mirrors to do that. Next slide, please. Next slide, okay. The Illanga Concentrated Solar Power is the fourth one, and again, this one is again in South Africa, and its capacity 100 megawatts. Illanga has no problem with contractors, but it is still on the construction, and when it is completed, it will be possible to produce enough energy for a large number of people, and there will be 340,000 tons of CO2 emissions which are avoided by using this solar plant. The fifth, next slide, the fifth mitigation project going on in the continent is Kathu Solar Park, again in South Africa. And again, this one is expected and is avoiding a lot of people. 179,000 tons, it will light 179,000 tons, and will avoid offset something like 6 million tons of CO2 avoided by using this solar plant. Now, one of the questions which we have in Africa is employment. If we use these mitigation projects, like the one I've just named, the 5, there are two phases of employment. There are phase of construction. When they are being constructed, they will employ a lot of people, as I've indicated in the five slides. But when they are completed, they will still employ a lot of people. And hence, the reason, not as much as when they're being constructed, but they will create employment for people. And this is the area where we can use this to naturalize the technology. Have the people who are employed there, who are bright and are able to do things, bring them in and have them take the leadership of building future such plants and building future mirrors that can be used to harness other technology, the solar energy in other places. So the use of the people is very, very important, and hence we should not avoid using mitigation projects in the sense that we fear that they will deny our people of jobs. The next slide is just a quick review of some of the planned projects, African projects, which are going to produce energy. There are 236,211 megawatts which are operating, and there are 3,100 projects which are doing that in the continent. The construction, in construction, there are 42,649 megawatts which are being constructed. This is now need to be updated with the Senegal one, which is another 100,000 megawatt which has been proposed. And there are 249 projects which are planned. There are still other plans of using solar. All of this is energy from solar, which are planned, and 294,000 megawatts are planned, and there are 2,324 projects which are going on. So mitigation is happening in the continent. It's something which we need to embrace and we need to continue. Next slide, please. Next slide. Sorry for this. I'm now coming home. This is Kenya, power sources in Kenya. And we will see from this table that hydro is still our leading producer of power, but it's being followed very closely by geothermal, and very surprisingly thermal. Now here again is the curse of the power contracting. In 1986, when we had a drought, we introduced thermal. And those thermal which were introduced in 1986 are still going on, despite the fact that we have greatly increased the amount of power coming from geothermal, and the hydro has also been slightly increased. But much more still is that the wind power, as I said earlier, has added 310 megawatts of energy. And therefore the question is, if we are going to be true to the international convention and of eliminating greenhouse gases, do we need to continue with the use of thermal energy producers in the country? The other thing is that when they were introduced in 1986, we were told that they will operate when the water level was low, and will be turned off when the water level is high. These thermal plants have been going on throughout, whether the rivers are flooded or not. So it is again another way of contracting which needs to be looked into and to be seen on how to avoid them. These other power energies are there. The one which I want to emphasize is the wind power has been introduced, and it is not 25 as I have indicated here, but it is now which is coming from the wind. And of course, the solar power. Next slide. In Garissa is contributing 2% of national energy mix. So with all this introduction of geothermal, hydropower, wind power, and solar, one would expect that the consumer's pocket would be eased. But in Kenya, it is the reverse. We are still squeezing the consumer hardest. Next slide, please. Let me now go to what I love most, adaptation. Because in the continent, this is the only thing we can do. And you can do it yourself. We can make everyone do something to save the planet. And I know we love to ask, what is the government doing? What is my company doing? What is the United Nations doing? What are the donors doing? Those are wrong questions, ladies and gentlemen. We have to accept that in this era, with the threat we have, each and every one has a right to do something in adaptation. And what some of the sources that we can do is, when you are building your house, make sure you put it in a secure location. That is adaptation, so that when there is flooding, you are not washed down. When you are building schools, when you are building hospitals, when you are putting infrastructures like roads, railroads, and the other, put them and plant them in safer locations. All right? We can do landscape restoration and reforestation. When you plant a tree, you don't plant it for the government. Stop cutting forests. You plant a tree for yourself, for your survival. Take it as, this is my survival, and therefore I have to plant this tree. Don't say, oh, the chief has not told me to plant tree, or the DC or what have you has told us to plant trees. No, it is me who is planting these trees because I want to survive in this changed climate. There are a lot of natural disasters which are going, and they will continue to occur. See how you can avoid these disasters. It is not the government, but I have a phrase which I normally use in my lectures of this lady who was drowning in Nyando River in Kenya, and she said, "Hey, serikali utusaidie," or government, help us. It is not the government to help you, it is you to help yourself. Don't wait for the government to come and help you. The time for serikali utusaidie is gone. We are in borrowed time, so we have to do everything in order to save ourselves. When we destroy nature, nature has a very vicious way of hitting back, coming back. So please stop destroying nature. Help nature by doing things that support nature. When you dig up to the riverbank, for example, and you have the river washing all of your land, don't say it is God. God is very busy, as somebody said. He's helping everybody everywhere. Help yourself. Don't dig up to the riverbed and the riverbank. And if you are we have now COVID, and you say, oh, I'm not going to be vaccinated, or I'm not going to wear masks, or I'm going to crowd people. And when the disease kills you, then you blame the government or you blame somebody else. Let us all be aware that nature always is very vicious when we provoke it. So let us not provoke nature, and let's see if we can avoid as many things as possible to make sure we are safe tomorrow. So let me try to summarize this area, that Africa's needs is in adaptation, given its vulnerability and its negligible contribution to current and or historical emissions. And our African Union has resolved and decided that for Africa, where to spend money is in adaptation, not in mitigation, though adaptation can also mitigate. When you plant trees and you reforest, the trees will absorb the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You are doing mitigation. When you plow and you don't disturb the soil, and you grow in agricultural, you grow fruits and plants in agriculturally conservative way, you are also mitigating. You are not allowing the carbon dioxide in the soil or the rotten roots to go into the atmosphere. So by doing adaptation does not mean that we are not mitigating. We are mitigating at the same time, except we don't have the big money to, say, capture the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and lock it under a cave somewhere. That is an expense we cannot afford. We do not have the big money to do some of the things like doing electrification of all the countryside and hence run on electric cars and electric vehicles. We still have not reached there, but we can still begin to do those things. It is also apparent, according to the convention, the Climate Change Convention, that we still need assistance in the continent, and we'll need assistance of about $20 to $30 billion per annum over the next 10 to 20 years to assist us in doing this. But in giving this assistance, there's a tendency that the West is now taking. Oh, we cannot give you money because you are corrupt. That reminds me of the days when I used to go to the UNESCO Executive Board. And when I arrived there, there was a special ambassador who was very fond of looking and greeting me. Whenever I come in, every 6 months, he comes and say, "Oh, Son Excellence, nice to see you." I say, "Nice to see you too." And then he will say, "How is the situation?" And I ask, "What situation?" Then he will reply, "Corruption." So when he saw me, the only thing he was seeing is corruption written in my face. That is the over-dramatization of what is happening in the continent. I believe all developed countries and everybody else elsewhere has gone through the phases of corruption and misuse of money. But it should not be used as an excuse to stop assisting Africa. I am as poor as a church mouse, and when I'm being told how is the corruption, I remember how sadly I am that somebody is putting me as one of those corrupt. That one is not the way that we should go.